Sometimes I believed that human civilization never rested on technology, progress, cities, or empires, but on a thin, almost invisible thread of memory. Memory was the hidden nerve connecting morning awakenings to yesterday's experience, nations to their past mistakes, a person to their own name. So when humanity lost its memory for a single day, it was not a simple collective amnesia. It was what ancient peoples once felt during a solar eclipse, a sign that the world no longer belonged to itself. We had long assumed that catastrophes arrived with thunder, earthquakes, or explosions, but the greatest blow in human history began with the absence of sound. The world awoke, and every link between one day and the next had snapped. The first minutes of the void. I call that morning the void, though technically it differed little from any other. The sun rose, shadows stretched in their usual direction, birds took to the sky. But in the consciousness of humanity there opened a black hole, a torn-out page, a missing reference. People awoke in homes they did not recognize. Beside them lay unfamiliar faces whose names had vanished like inscriptions eroded from ancient clay. Streets filled with individuals looking around like soldiers after shell shock, disoriented, bereft not only of bearings but of themselves. On one continent, parents looked at their children as if seeing strangers. On another, ministers stood in their offices not knowing what documents meant. Pilots, machinists, surgeons, all who were meant to perform complex tasks that morning, simply stopped. It was as if the world had rolled back several centuries to a time before system, continuity, or history existed. Memory did not disappear selectively, it disappeared completely. Not isolated memories, not specific names, not events from the previous day. Everything. Humanity lost the knowledge of where it worked, skills tied to intentional expertise, awareness of who loved whom, memory of individual purpose, the accumulated experience that held society together. But worst of all, humanity lost the memory of fear, of former mistakes, of the boundaries that prevented destruction. Without those invisible barriers, mankind stepped into a day that resembled not present reality, but an experiment conducted upon itself. The first hours, a world that stopped without a single explosion. Just as Europe sleptwalked into the First World War in 1914, unaware that it had crossed a historical threshold, so did we enter the day without memory, without comprehending its consequences. On highways, cars sat sideways across lanes. Drivers no longer knew where they were going or why. In airports, thousands stared at departure boards, unsure if they had been passengers or merely passers-by. At borders, guards holding rifles looked at each other and asked what exactly they were guarding. In some countries, soldiers awoke with weapons in their hands, but without the discipline, motivation, or fear that had held armies together for millennia. Bankers opened vaults, not knowing why the papers inside mattered. Teachers walked into classrooms only to find children staring at them with the same vacant question. It was as if someone had yanked out the foundational pillar of the human mind, and the world began to sway. Social structure collapsed within an hour. Imagine an anthill stripped of instinct. Physically intact, structurally present, but without any concept of what to do. That was us. We lost not only individual memory, we lost collective logic. The so-called social contract dissolved instantly, just as in Germany in 1932 when millions of citizens, exhausted and disillusioned, abandoned faith in their institutions and opened the gates to extremism. But this time there were no extremists, because no one remembered who they were. Only chaos remained, pure and primitive, like the fire that consumed the Library of Alexandria. Mass questioning, "Who am I?" as the first universal phrase. That day became known as the Day of the Universal Question. People approached each other not with fear, not with emotion, not with plea, but with a single desperate logical inquiry. Who am I? Those two words became the emblem of an era. They echoed through plazas, subways, hospitals, and parliamentary halls, like a mantra, like a prayer, like a metric of civilizational collapse. And no one had an answer. Governments react, the instinct of authority versus the instinct of survival. Governments lost their intellect, but not their institutions. Soldiers forgot their identities, but remembered how to fire a weapon. Pilots forgot their names, but recognized which buttons not to press. Muscle memory, procedural memory, subconscious memory all survived. And so the dawn of the first memoryless day was surreal. The world behaved as if it still functioned and yet did not understand why. It was a phantom civilization, a living corpse of governance, like Weimar Germany, intact on paper, hollow within. Only this time there were no ideologues, no parties, no manifestos, just automatic motion, the last breath of the old world. Where memory disappears, fiction becomes power. In places where knowledge evaporates, imagination becomes the sharpest weapon. Various regions generated their own explanations, and the first to explain the chaos became leaders. Some proclaimed divine punishment, others insisted it was a cosmic reset. Still others swore the world had been attacked, or that humanity was part of an experiment. In the absence of memory, mythology filled the gap instantly. The entire planet became a laboratory for new belief systems. And I, among them. As a historian, I experienced that day as if I had been reborn, not bodily, but civilizationally. I awoke on the floor of my study, smelling ink, paper, and cold stone. On the desk lay manuscripts, my own, though I recognized neither the style nor the handwriting. For several minutes, I did not understand that what I was reading had been written by me. In a world without memory, every life became an imposter, every person a stranger to themselves. And this strangeness was not only a tragedy, it marked the beginning of a monumental experiment on the very nature of humanity. He who forgets the past is condemned to repeat it. But on that morning, humanity forgot not the past, it forgot the concept of past. And it became clear. What followed would not be a repetition of history, but its rupture. The next chapters of this chronicle will describe how humanity, stripped of its most vital tool, memory, began to build a new world. A world where every action was the first, where every step was blind, where every truth could become falsehood, and every lie be crowned truth. And that world proved more terrifying than any war. If the first minutes of the memoryless day were a personal catastrophe, the first hours became a geopolitical one. What began as confusion in living rooms and hallways soon spiraled into the most dangerous vacuum a civilization can face. A world with institutions, but without the memories that animate them. For centuries, humanity believed collapse must thunder, through invasions, meteors, plagues, revolutions. But the disappearance of memory was a quieter force, a soft hand that unplugged the spine of civilization while leaving its limbs twitching. Those limbs, governments, corporations, armies, markets, continued to move, but with no brain to guide them. At first glance, nation-states seemed intact. Buildings stood, flags hung, offices glowed with morning light. But inside those halls, thousands of officials and bureaucrats woke with no recollection of their roles. In a ministry of finance, an official stared at spreadsheets he couldn't interpret. In a foreign ministry, diplomats stared at maps like archaeologists examining an alien artifact. Presidential guards stood resolutely at their posts, unaware of whom they were protecting or why. The news channels broadcast muted footage of these silent buildings, labels rolling underneath like epitaphs of a civilization, like government resumes unknown functions, ministers unable to identify portfolios. Parliament convenes without memory of past legislation. Nowhere was the tragedy as visible as in the ruins of bureaucracy, that vast machine built on continuity. A government without memory can sign nothing, plan nothing, command nothing. It can merely exist. The Weimar Republic had collapsed slowly, under the weight of distrust and inflation. Here, institutions collapsed instantly, not from malice, but from emptiness. Economists later called it the day of zero transaction. For the first time since the invention of markets, money stopped moving. Not a crash, not a panic, just cessation. Bank employees logged into systems whose logic they could not follow. Trading floors filled with blinking monitors no one dared touch. Businesses stared at invoices whose meaning eluded them. Consumers held money they no longer recognized as useful. It was not a recession, not a depression, but a moment when the entire global economy forgot why it existed. Accounts froze because no one remembered their passwords. Contracts became meaningless because no one recalled agreeing to them. Currency lost value not because it hyperinflated, but because it lost context. $10 was a number. A city block was a shape. Ownership was a superstition. The economic world returned to its primordial state, not barter, but confusion. I remember stepping outside that morning, watching people hold banknotes as though examining artifacts from a forgotten tribe. One man gently rubbed a coin between his fingers, hoping that some latent memory would surface. It never did. The sociologists would later describe the first hours as the unanchoring, a term borrowed from naval disasters, when ships snap from their moorings and drift helplessly towards the rocks. Cities that once pulsed with intention now wandered. Commuters boarded buses without knowing their destinations. Parents left homes they did not feel were theirs. Tourists drifted through museums holding guidebooks they could not read. In some places, crowds gathered instinctively, not out of solidarity, but because humans gravitate to other humans in uncertainty. Squares filled with thousands repeating variations of the same question. Does anyone know what happened? But there was no wisdom to be found. The blind led the blind, and the silence between them became the loudest sound in history. Skill remained, but its context did not. A surgeon remembered how to hold a scalpel, but didn't know why a patient lay before him. An engineer recognized the components of a reactor, yet couldn't recall whether it was safe to touch. A pilot knew how to navigate an aircraft, but had no idea where he was meant to fly it, or whether he had passengers. Airports grounded every plane out of sheer instinct. Hospitals paused every procedure unless survival was immediate. Factories shut down, their machines whining into unnatural quiet. Civilization entered a paradoxical state, capability without purpose. It reminded me of the monasteries of medieval Europe, where monks meticulously copied books whose meaning they did not always understand, preserving knowledge for a future they could not imagine. This time, the monks were the entire human species, and the books were our own identities. In every crowd, someone inevitably stepped forward, not from authority, but from charisma, fearlessness, delusion, or sheer luck. In a subway station in Tokyo, a man climbed onto a bench and declared himself the Rememberer, claiming he alone understood the crisis. He didn't, but hundreds followed him because he spoke with confidence. In Munich, a woman held up a first aid manual and proclaimed herself healer of the district. Others obeyed because the book made her appear knowledgeable. In Rio, a teenager discovered a police badge on the ground and immediately wore it, and in a world without memory, that was enough. And in several regions, the most dangerous leaders emerged, those who invented explanations so beautiful, so terrifying, so complete, that thousands believed them instantly. No authoritarian had an easier audience than one stripped of memory. This was how the first proto-states of the memoryless day emerged, not from power, but from narrative. Because when memory dies, stories become kings. By noon, the world had split into thousands of micro-societies, each one guided by whatever fragments of identity it stumbled upon. A group of miners in Chile united around the fact that they all wore helmets. Dentists in Paris locked themselves inside clinics, deciding that they were the guardians of mouths. Marines stationed near Okinawa instinctively formed a perimeter, not knowing who the enemy was, but knowing that structure comforted them. Humanity shattered along lines of coincidence. Every object became a clue, every action an origin myth, every stranger a potential prophet or threat. And in this global confusion, violence simmered, not out of hate, but out of uncertainty. As in the early days of medieval Europe after Rome's collapse, mistrust became the default. A world without memory becomes a world where everyone is foreign. I too was a fragment, a single cell in this organism of confusion. I stumbled through my office, studying artifacts of my former self. Books annotated in handwriting I didn't recognize. Maps pinned with colored string like a crime scene. A shelf of historical journals that seemed both familiar and alien. And then the discovery. A sentence written on a bookmark tucked into a worn volume of Thucydides. History is not what happened. It is what we remember about what happened. I stared at that line for a long time, not because I understood it, but because something in me suspected its importance. Those words became my anchor, my first belief in the new reality, a lifeline thrown into the ocean of forgetting. By the end of the first hour, humanity had stopped. By the end of the third, it had fractured. By the end of the sixth, it had begun to reinvent itself according to whatever symbols it found in the rubble of its former mind. But the true disaster, the economic implosion, the religious awakenings, the wars of identity, the reconfiguration of nations and the birth of new belief, all that was still ahead. Part 3 will describe how, within a single day, humanity built an entirely new world out of the ashes of forgetting, a world more volatile, more primitive, and more revealing than anything that came before it. If the morning of the memoryless day was defined by shock, then the afternoon was defined by creation. Wild, desperate, primitive creation. Humanity, robbed of its past, began building a new one with the instinct of a species that refused to die even when stripped of its identity. The world split, multiplied, reformed. Civilization collapsed and immediately began to reinvent itself from the debris. These 12 hours became a compressed evolution of humanity, a reenactment of our entire history, from tribe to state, from myth to law, from fear to order, but at a speed so unnatural, so violent, that every moment felt like a century. This was the hour when the world, forgetting everything, started to remember itself anew. By midday, humanity had reorganized, not rationally, not politically, but primally. We are a social species, and a social species without memory seeks belonging. So the first new identities of this empty world were not nations, not religions, not ideologies, but clusters of people tied together by the meaningless symbols they found around them. In a single park in Toronto, a group wearing red shirts formed the Crimson People. Joggers with similar shoes became the Fleet. 24 strangers holding the same brand of coffee cup declared themselves the Keepers of the Cup. In Cairo, construction workers gathered around their tools, believing the equipment signified their sacred function. In Seoul, subway passengers banded together by train line color. In Lagos, motorcyclists formed a spontaneous brotherhood of the wheel. Anthropologists call this phenomenon symbolic tribalism, a return to prehistory where symbols determined safety. But the speed of tribal formation was unprecedented. In 12 hours, humanity created more tribes than existed in the entirety of the Paleolithic era. Tribes bring belonging, but belonging brings division. Division brings conflict. The first fights were absurd, almost laughable, if they hadn't been so deadly. In Athens, the blue group clashed with the circle people because each believed the city square belonged to them. In Bogotá, 2 neighboring emergency shelters fought over a generator because one group interpreted the "on" label as a sacred symbol. In Chicago, a group that discovered medical scrubs tried to assert dominance over a nearby cluster who found police jackets. These conflicts resembled neither war nor rebellion. They were the collisions of identities formed in ignorance, pure reflex, untempered by memory or reason. It was a reenactment of early medieval Europe, when fragmented war bands fought over ideology they could not articulate. But here the ideology was not belief, it was confusion. Every society requires leaders, and in a memoryless world, leaders were not those with wisdom, experience, or charisma, but those who signaled authority. This created a new class I call the signalers, individuals who, by accident of appearance or possession, were interpreted as legitimate figures. A man wearing a firefighter jacket became the de facto leader of an entire district in Melbourne. A woman with a lab coat wrote the first laws of a neighborhood in Buenos Aires, Aires. A teenager with a megaphone in Warsaw was treated as the city's sole source of truth. One chilling example occurred in Berlin. A man found an old Roman-style costume from a theater storage room and wandered outside wearing it. To a population without memory, he looked ancient, authoritative, wise. Within an hour, hundreds followed him. By evening, thousands. He issued commands without knowing why he issued them, and they were obeyed as if divine. Civilization, when stripped to its bone, rebuilds hierarchy instantly. Humanity cannot endure the void. It searches for structure the way lungs search for air. Cities, usually engines of complexity, turned into traps of confusion. The more advanced the infrastructure, the more disastrously it failed. Traffic lights blinked meaninglessly. Transit systems froze. Skyscrapers became mazes where tens of thousands wandered without ownership, purpose, or context. Dense urban centers collapsed under the weight of their own complexity. New York split into hundreds of territorial micro-states. Shanghai fragmented into vertical sky tribes, each floor claiming autonomy. Delhi turned its markets into defensive fortresses. London's parks became fields of semi-permanent encampments. The world experienced a reversal of urbanization, not towards rural stability, but to chaos. It took only 6 hours for cities that took centuries to rise to dissolve into political dust. When memory dies, myth rushes in. People needed a reason, a story, a cause. By 4 p.m., the first new religions had emerged, each one explaining the Day of Forgetting in its own way. In Mexico City, a sect declared that the sun had reset humanity to test moral worth. In Moscow, a faction believed the forgetting was punishment from ancestors. In Nairobi, a group concluded that the sky itself had erased memory because humans had become arrogant. In Montreal, a cult worshipped a vending machine whose lights still blinked, believing it to be a divine relic. Theological systems formed as fast as tribes. Humanity, deprived of memory, created explanations in the language of instinct. It was a return to ancient cosmology, but on fast forward. These religions would have battled for dominance if it was not for what happened next. Amid the chaos, something extraordinary happened, a moment of near simultaneous realization across continents. People began to understand that this condition was universal. They couldn't articulate the scale. They had no memory of communication systems, no understanding of global news, but human instinct sensed it collectively. Everyone had forgotten. Everyone was lost. Everyone was equal. For the first and only time in history, the entire world arrived at the same truth, at the same hour. This recognition did not bring peace, but it brought orientation, a baseline. A new world, even one born of forgetting, requires a shared premise. Humanity had found one, but now it needed a plan. By early evening, tribes began sending representatives to negotiate boundaries, resources, and survival. These gatherings were not councils in the modern sense. They were primitive assemblies resembling those of ancient Germanic tribes or early Athenian demoi. People brought objects to prove identity: helmets, kitchen utensils, books, badges, uniforms. These became tokens of authority, artifacts of legitimacy. Some councils failed instantly, collapsing into violence. Others agreed to share food or exchange shelter. In the ruins of Philadelphia, a council formed around a man who had discovered a janitor's key ring. To those without memory, the keys symbolized access, therefore leadership. In Krakow, a council formed from hospital workers, not because they remembered being healers, but because their building was full of beds. A primitive political system emerged, one based not on ideology or history, but on proximity and symbol. This was humanity's first attempt to rebuild society, blindly, awkwardly, instinctively. And all of it happened within the span of an afternoon. As the sun dipped toward the horizon, something profound settled over the world. Not peace, not understanding, but a collective exhale, a pause, a stillness before the next stage of the crisis. People found shelter not because they remembered what night meant, but because the changing light stirred ancient instincts older than civilization. The fear of darkness is a fossil imprinted in the human brain. By 7 p.m., fires were lit in nearly every city. Groups huddled in circles. The first songs, if they could be called that, were hummed softly in dozens of languages whose meanings were forgotten. A world that had lost memory began to grow new ones, primitive, fragile, but memories nonetheless. What humanity built between noon and sunset was unprecedented. New tribes, new hierarchies, new religions, new political structures, new fears, new myths. And all of it without reference to anything that came before. The subsequent part, Part 4, we'll describe how night transformed the world further, how darkness birthed danger, how primitive states solidified, how fear of the unknown set entire continents aflame, and how the first attempts at recovering memory appeared among the ruins. Civilizations are not built in daylight. Daylight reveals, it clarifies, exposes, demands reason. But night is the architect of myth. And on the Memoryless day, when darkness finally fell, humanity entered its most dangerous phase, not because night hid threats, but because it gave humanity the freedom to invent them. If the afternoon had been a frantic rebirth of tribes and identities, then night became the crucible in which entire new histories were forged, crafted from instinct, superstition, fear, and a yearning for meaning. This was the moment when the human species, stripped of memory, created hundreds of parallel civilizations, each with its own truth, its own past, its own myth of origin. The world split not along geography, but along imagination. When the sun finally disappeared beyond the horizon, something ancient stirred, a fear so primal, so deeply etched in our biological marrow that even the erasure of memory could not touch it. Humanity no longer knew the word night, but their bodies remembered. Heart rate spiked, muscles tensed, eyes widened. Campfires were lit in frantic bursts, as if guided not by reason, but by a million-year-old instinct whispering, "Light protects." Entire crowds gathered around burning trash cans, lanterns, abandoned cars with headlights still working. Fire became the new axis of civilization, a center around which thousands of tiny societies formed, and these campfires, scattered across the world like stars inverted onto the earth, became the birthplaces of the first night legends. Memory was gone, but imagination, unshackled from fact, became more powerful than ever. Around fires, groups began telling each other stories about the world that had existed earlier that same morning, stories invented on the spot, but believed instantly. I myself heard a man in the ruins of my district explain with absolute certainty that, "We once lived under the sea. The sky was made of water. Today, it's shattered." In Lisbon, a group insisted they had descended from birds. In Bangkok, a cluster claimed the world had always been memoryless, and the strange morning was a dream. In Nairobi, people concluded they had died and were wandering through some interim afterlife. These were not lies, not manipulations. They were desperate attempts to fill the vacuum where memory should have been, attempts to anchor identity in an ocean of uncertainty. As a historian, I recognized a terrible pattern. Humanity had compressed the cultural evolution of millennia into one night. Prehistory, religion, folktales, cosmologies, mythopoesis, all emerging simultaneously in billions of minds hungry for meaning. Night hid faces. Night blurred boundaries. Night amplified suspicion. And suspicion, without memory to temper it, became deadly. The first nocturnal conflicts did not erupt over land or food or resources, but on ideas, abstract, shapeless ideas invented only hours earlier. In Buenos Aires, two tribes fought because one believed fire was a sacred spirit, while the other believed it was a beast to be controlled. In Johannesburg, a group claiming sky origins clashed with a group claiming earth ancestry. In Delhi, dozens died because two groups disagreed about whether night was temporary or eternal. These were not wars, they were collisions of mythologies born seconds apart. And they revealed a truth I had always suspected as a historian. Violence does not need history. Violence needs only meaning, even if invented. Where there is myth, there is authority.
And where there is authority, there are interpreters. By late evening, a new kind of leader emerged across continents, the fake historian, people who appointed themselves guardians of truth, interpreters of symbols, prophets of the before. Some carried books they found randomly and read aloud from them as if they were scripture. Others pointed at stars and invented astrological doctrines. Still others declared fragments of text carved into buildings to be holy commandments. At one encampment, a man found a physics textbook and recited formulas to a crowd who believed him a priest. At another, a woman discovered an old family album and convinced her tribe they were reincarnations of the ancestors pictured there. It was as if the entire world had become a medieval court where anyone holding a scroll, any scroll, became an oracle. These fake historians built the first narrative empires of the night, worldviews based on debris, and billions followed them. Something changed at midnight. Up until then, humanity had been lost, scattered, confused, fragmented. But as the night deepened, two great philosophical camps emerged across the entire planet, mirroring ancient divides that had once shaped civilizations. People who felt, instinctively, that memory must exist, that something precious had been taken from them, that the world was wrong. They gathered around libraries, universities, museums, buildings they did not recognize but felt drawn to. These people spent the night searching through books, hard drives, carvings, scraps of paper, trying to reconstruct a world whose outlines they sensed but could not see. They believed truth was recoverable. They believed humanity was injured, not reborn. They believed that mourning would matter. Those who believed memory was a curse humanity had shed, that forgetting was liberation, not tragedy, that the old world had trapped them, and that the memoryless day was the beginning of a new, pure humanity. Their mantra became, "If we forgot it, we didn't need it." They burned books, destroyed digital archives, smashed symbols of the past. To them, the rememberers were blasphemers, clinging to the ghosts of a world that deserved to be forgotten. Thus, the night drew its first true global ideological border, not nations, not religions, not tribes, but belief in memory itself. A civil war was now inevitable. Technology depends on continuity, updates, manuals, passwords, protocols. Memory is its blood. By 1 a.m., nearly all advanced systems had died. Server farms overheated, trains stuck permanently between stations, satellites drifted without command, water systems malfunctioned, power grids tripped from mismatched loads. One by one, lights went out across the world, not because power was gone, but because no one remembered how to keep it flowing. The memoryless day marked the end of the technological era, not because machines failed, but because humans forgot why they needed them. Around 2 a.m., clusters of rememberers managed to do something extraordinary. They formed the first functional governments since the morning collapse. Not nations, but enclaves of order. In Copenhagen, a group barricaded a university library and declared it a sanctuary of knowledge. In Kyoto, a temple became the headquarters of a quasi-clerical government centered around written wisdom. In Toronto, doctors, engineers, and mathematicians formed a logic circle, making decisions through deduction rather than memory. These enclaves believed that order could be restored through reason. They were wrong, not in principle, but in timing. For the renewed vastly outnumbered them. and the renewed feared one thing above all: the return of the old world. At 3 a.m., violence took its darkest turn. The renewed began hunting rememberers, not from hatred, but from terror. To the renewed, memory was poison. To the rememberers, forgetting was death. And so the world entered its most primitive phase, a war over the right to remember. Libraries burned. Museums were stormed by people who did not know what a hard drive was, only that the object represented a threat to their new identity. It was the Reformation, the French Revolution, and the fall of Rome compressed into a single hour. And as flames rose across cities, the world woke to its darkest realization. Humanity had lost memory, but not violence, not fear, not tribal instinct, not the impulse to control truth. The past was gone, but the oldest part of human nature had survived untouched. By 4 a.m., the world stood on the edge. Billions divided into factions built on substitutions for memory. Fires consumed symbols of the old world. Darkness ruled. And yet, in the ruins of hundreds of cities, in libraries, hospitals, universities, and quiet corners, rememberers clung to scraps of truth: a photograph, a sentence, a medical chart, a newspaper, a carved name, a whisper. They believed mourning would matter. They believed memory might return. And if it did, there had to be something left to recover. So they preserved, quietly, desperately, heroically. The renewed burned. The rememberers hid truths in the dark. Two civilizations warring over a future neither could see. And then, at the darkest moment of the night, something happened. A tremor, global, impossible. Humanity stirred, millions simultaneously, as if a page was being turned inside their minds. Memory was starting to return, but not fully, not gently, not safely. What followed at sunrise would decide the fate of humanity, a species with two histories, two truths, and one day that split the world in half. Dawn arrived like a blade, not softly, not gradually, but with a violence only memory can deliver. For when the sun rose on the memoryless day's second morning, the impossible happened. Memory returned, everywhere, everyone, all at once. The world, which hours before had been a chaotic mosaic of tribes, myths, proto-states, and invented histories, awoke to two simultaneous realities: the truth of who they had been and the truth of what they had done without knowing who they were. This was the most psychologically devastating moment in human history, far worse than the forgetting itself. If the day had been a descent into primal instinct, then the morning after was a confrontation with guilt, horror, and unbearable duality. Civilizations do not survive such mornings. Humanity barely did. It happened like a switch thrown in the brainstem of the world. There were no signs, no warnings, no tremors in the air, just a single instant, and billions of minds lit up like storm-struck circuitry. People gasped, screamed, collapsed, vomited. Some fainted outright. Others clutched their heads, as if trying to hold their skulls together under the flight of returning identity. In that moment, every mind was forced to reconcile two selves, the one who had lived all their life and the one who had lived the day without memory. People remembered their names, their families, their duties, their cities, their countries, their histories. And they also remembered the tribes they joined, the myths they spread, the violence they committed, the objects they worshipped.
the lies they believed, the people they harmed, the symbols they fought for. Everything came back at once. Everything collided. No brain was prepared. The first universal human response that morning was denial. Hundreds of millions insisted the previous day had been a nightmare, hallucination, a delusion brought on by some unknown gas or virus. But the evidence lay everywhere. Burned libraries, destroyed servers, tribal paint on faces, makeshift flags made of bed sheets, crude weapons, bonfires in every city, barricades on highways, smashed artifacts, mass graves hastily dug during the night, strange symbols painted on buildings, people dressed in improvised uniforms, and videos, millions of them, recorded on forgotten phones and cameras. Humanity watched itself behaving like a prehistoric species, mindless, tribal, violent, myth-making. The world had tried to reinvent itself and succeeded disastrously. Denial collapsed under the weight of evidence. The next wave was shame, vast, suffocating, collective. People remembered the faces of strangers they had attacked. They were called the books they had burned, the lies they believed with zealous certainty, the leaders they had followed simply because they spoke loudly, the tribes they had joined based on clothing, color, or coincidence. Worse, parents remembered not recognizing their children. Doctors remembered turning away patients out of confusion. Neighbors remembered threatening one another over invented myths. It was as if humanity had glimpsed its most primitive reflection, and now recoiled. A man in Tokyo threw himself from a balcony after remembering he had beaten the person thinking they belonged to a rival lamppost tribe. A woman in Munich suffered a heart attack upon realizing she had burned an entire room of historical documents she thought were cursed. A group of teenagers in Brazil begged forgiveness on their knees in front of a library they had vandalized. Shame rolled across the world like a second sunrise, scorching everything in its path. Anger followed, slowly at first, then universally. But anger requires an object, and humanity found itself without one. Who was to blame? The self? Strangers? Chance? God? Biology? Fate? Everyone wanted an enemy. For shame without an enemy collapses into despair. Two theories emerged instantly. Theory A, the intrusion, that the memory loss was caused intentionally by a government, a corporation, a religious sect, a foreign power, an alien force. Theory B, the collapse, that the memory loss was a natural phenomenon, a cosmic event, a microbial interference, a quantum disruption. Both theories had believers. Both found supporting evidence in scraps and coincidences. Both sparked new infighting among people who had only just regained themselves. But the real danger was Theory C, the belief forming among millions that the memory loss was a test and humanity had failed. This belief threatened to break the fragile quiet of the morning. By 7 a.m., the first governments reassembled, not because they knew what to do, but because institutions tend to reform where structures exist. Presidents returned to offices, prime ministers reconvened cabinets, parliaments gathered, shaking. And as always, someone proposed order, someone proposed calm, someone proposed investigation, and someone proposed war. A few nations declared states of emergency. Others declared moments of silence. In some countries, leaders took responsibility for nothing, but apologized for everything. In others, regimes used the chaos to strengthen their grip. In authoritarian states, the memoryless day was treated as proof that freedom was dangerous. In democratic states, it was proof that unity was fragile. In failing states, it was the final push toward collapse. Governments attempted to reassure populations that the event would not repeat, but how could they know? Memory was back, certainty was not. During the night, two ideological factions had formed: the Rememberers, who sought truth, and the Renewed, who believed forgetting was salvation. When memory returned, their followers remembered both their previous identities and the new ones they had adopted. This produced a psychic fracture. In many places, members of the Renewed were consumed with grief, for they realized they had destroyed irreplaceable knowledge. In others, they clung to their invented myths even after regaining memory, insisting that their night beliefs were spiritually true even if factually false. The Rememberers, meanwhile, became political heroes or dangerous radicals, depending on the government stance. Many were appointed to crisis councils. Others were arrested for hoarding truth, as some governments feared that the preserved information might discredit them. The world entered a cold war between two identities: the people we were and the people we became during the forgetting. The most powerful moment of the morning came late, when people returned to archives, libraries, museums, journals, digital archives, personal photos, diaries, and letters, and found them vandalized, burned, or rearranged by the memoryless world. Humanity stood before the ruins of its own knowledge. Entire museums emptied, libraries half-charred, databases corrupted, government records scrambled. History, the thing I had devoted my life to, was now a mosaic missing half its tiles. I walked through my university's archive room like a survivor of a bombed cathedral. Half the manuscripts were gone. Others had been rewritten with childish drawings or tribal marks. A few had survived, hidden by rememberers during the night. And in that moment I realized we would spend decades reconstructing what had been lost in 12 hours. By midday, humanity had accepted a horrifying truth. We now possessed two memories: the true memory, our real identities, histories, families, nations, and the false memory, the invented myths, tribes, actions, fears, and beliefs we formed in the vacuum. These two memories did not merge, they collided, they contradicted, they tore at each other. Humanity had become a species with dual pasts. A professor from Geneva wrote one of the first essays after the incident. For the first time in history, humanity remembers what it was and what it is capable of becoming when stripped of identity. And that knowledge, that we could revert to tribal, violent, myth-making creatures in mere hours, haunted the world. Children asked their parents why their toys were burned. Parents asked themselves why they had believed strangers were enemies. Nations asked how close they came to self-destruction. And everyone asked the same question: can it happen again? Governments promised no. Scientists said maybe. Theologians said yes. Philosophers said it had never truly stopped happening. The day ended with civilization restored, but never healed, because memory had returned, but insanity had not. History rarely changes in an instant. Empires rise through centuries, cultures shift through generations, ideologies evolve through struggle. But the memoryless day and the morning after left a scar that did not deepen gradually. It arrived fully formed, a continental fissure across the psyche of humanity. Part 6 tells the story not of the event, but of its afterlife. The slow, grinding, devastating consequences that echoed for years, reshaping nations, ethics, and human identity itself. This was the era historians call the Long Shadow, when society tried to reconcile two contradictory truths: the memory of who we were and the memory of who we became when stripped of memory. It was not the forgetting that destroyed the world, it was the remembering. The return of memory did not bring relief, it brought a new terror, the fear that the forgetting might return. Economists later found that every major market on Earth crashed between 12 p.m. and 3 p.m. that day, not because of material damage, but because fear became the global currency. Governments issued statements assuring populations the event was a once-in-history anomaly. Scientists insisted natural causes were unlikely to recur. Religious leaders framed it as prophecy fulfilled, not beginning. No one believed any of them. People stockpiled not just food, but notebooks. Entire cities sold out of pens, paper, recorders, carving tools, anything that could preserve information independently of the human mind. A global slogan emerged spontaneously: "Write everything down." It was painted on walls, printed on pamphlets, chanted in protests, written on children's shirts. Humanity behaved like a species expecting an imminent second wave, the way medieval Europe feared the return of plague. Memory became a fragile organ, a treasure, a liability, a weapon, and its potential disappearance hung over the world like a darkening star. As memory resurfaced and shame solidified, governments began hunting those who had committed violence during the Memoryless day. But how does one administer justice for crimes committed without identity, without motive, without memory at the time? Society fractured into two moral philosophies. A, the absolutists, who argued it does not matter why you harmed, only that you did. Under their pressure, countries enacted harsh punishments, mass arrests, public shaming rituals, forced labor programs, segregation of the violent tribes. Absolutist regimes rose in Eastern Europe, parts of East Asia, and several African and South American nations. To them, justice was necessary to prevent the Memoryless Day from becoming an excuse for anarchy. B, the relativists, who countered, "A crime without memory is not a crime." These societies refused to punish those who acted during the day. They argued that free will had not existed, that people had been animals, frightened, instinctual, acting without reason or identity. Relativist regions, Scandinavia, Canada, Japan, New Zealand, focused not on punishment, but psychological recovery. The conflict between these doctrines created a second ideological civil war, one fought not with violence, but with ethics. Courts split, governments collapsed, families tore apart debating guilt versus innocence. Humanity, suddenly remembering everything, could not agree on what remembering meant. By year 3 after the event, a new institution emerged, one unlike anything before or since: the memory courts. Their mandate was unprecedented: to determine legal responsibility for actions committed in a state of collective amnesia. These courts dealt with murders committed by people who no longer recognized their victims, destruction of property justified by invented myths, tribal wars fought with improvised weapons, children abandoned because parents did not know them, and the most controversial cases, acts of heroism performed by people who did not remember being heroes. The memory courts created entirely new legal categories: action in unconscious identity, instinctive harm, mythic motivation, symbol-induced aggression. No philosopher of the Enlightenment, no Roman jurist, no medieval theologian had prepared humanity for this level of moral absurdity. The memory courts became the most watched institutions on the planet. Every trial was a societal exorcism. And in every verdict, the same question echoed: who were we that day? A question no court ever fully answered. While governments attempted to restore order, two new global belief systems emerged from the ashes of Part 4's tribal night. The Rememberist faith. The Rememberists believed the Memoryless Day was a divine warning that humanity had worshipped forgetfulness long before the event, through distraction, apathy, and refusal to learn from history. Their temples were built around libraries. Their rituals centered on reading. Children were taught the phrase, "To forget is to die." Rememberists became powerful in academic and democratic societies. The doctrine of the second innocence. Opposing them was a radical movement, the renewed faith, a renewed continuation of the renewed faction from the memoryless night. They argued that forgetting had given humanity something precious, a chance to start over free of guilt and trauma. Their texts claimed, "The truest self is the self without memory." They destroyed historical documents, burned museums, protested courts, advocated for ritual forgetting through meditation, fasting, and neurochemical methods. Rememberists and renewed clashed violently in dozens of countries. Religion had become a battleground of memory itself. One of the strangest consequences of the event was the rise of memory refugees, individuals whose memories returned incompletely or painfully. Millions could not reconcile the life they remembered with the life they lived during the day. Some became overwhelmed, paranoid, self-destructive. Others refused to return to their old identities, parents abandoning families, spouses leaving marriages, workers refusing professions they no longer emotionally recognized. Governments created memory rehabilitation centers, half hospitals, half monasteries, to treat those suffocating under the duality of self. But for many, recovery was impossible. A man in Rome wrote in his journal, "I remember my wife. I also remember thinking she was a stranger. Both memories feel true. Who am I supposed to be now?" Humanity had healed the wound, but the scar remained infected. Perhaps the most terrifying long-term development emerged 5 years after the event. Flickers, brief, seconds-long lapses in memory. Not full amnesia, just enough to trigger panic. People froze in the middle of conversations. Workers paused machines for fear of mistakes. Drivers abandoned vehicles at intersections. Children screamed at the feeling of temporary unselfing. These flickers were short, harmless physiologically, but psychologically catastrophic. Humanity lived in constant terror of another full erasure. Governments installed reassurance networks, street screens reminding people of their names, public logs of daily events, tattoos used as identity anchors, and emergency memory kits distributed to every home. Civilization became obsessed with redundancy, multiple backups of identity, multiple journals, multiple recordings. The world had become a species preparing for another apocalypse of forgetting. As a historian, I found myself in the strangest position imaginable. I was now responsible not only for chronicling the past, but for protecting it against a world terrified of its own fragility. I lectured in ruined universities, spoke to memory courts, counseled grieving families, and traveled to archives salvaged from burned libraries. But I carried a deeper burden, the awareness that history had changed forever, not just in content, but in principle. Our relationship with the past was no longer stable. It trembled, vulnerable to forces we could not yet understand. I became convinced that the memoryless day was not a freak accident, but a revelation, a mirror showing us the thinness of the membrane separating civilization from savagery, identity from instinct, meaning from chaos. The world had looked into that mirror, and recoiled. But whether we learned from it, that remains uncertain. History has always been a river, flowing, continuous, predictable in its motion, even when violent in its course. But the memoryless day shattered that metaphor. History did not flow across that boundary, it jumped. It broke into two separate rivers, each carrying the same humanity, but with different waters. As I stand now, decades after the event, the world has stabilized in form, but never again in certainty. We entered a new era, not technological, not political, not spiritual, but ontological. Humanity did not simply evolve, it became something else. A species aware, for the first time, that its identity is not carved in stone, but written in sand. This is the chronicle of that final transformation. The legacy of the day we forgot everything, and the century we spent learning what memory really means. By the 30th year after the memoryless day, civilization had regained its structure, cities rebuilt, governments stabilized, economies restarted, schools reopened. Superficially, life resumed, but beneath the surface, humanity had changed more profoundly than after any war, revolution, or pandemic. Not because of what we lost, but because of what we learned about ourselves. The first lesson was brutal. Human identity is thinner than we ever imagined. The second was liberating. We can rebuild meaning even when all meaning collapses. And the third was terrifying. Memory is not stable. It can be taken or remade. These lessons shaped everything that followed. To survive, civilization built systems not to preserve life, but to preserve identity. Every person on Earth now has a personal continuity archive, a recorded, encrypted, daily log of their life, speech, preferences, and relationships. A chronoseal, a government-verified record of major decisions ensuring no one can deny their past. Identity redundancy networks, devices that broadcast your name and essential data during emergencies. Schools teach not only history, but memory discipline, emphasizing how fragile the mind can be. Hospitals operate memory resilience units, treating those traumatized not by forgetting, but by remembering too much. Humanity armored its mind the way medieval civilizations armored their body. For the first time, we realized memory needed infrastructure, and thus we built one. In the decades after the event, the world split into two philosophical civilizations. The remembered world, those who believed memory must be preserved at all costs, that culture, history, and identity were sacred. Their societies behave almost archival in nature, slow, deliberate, cautious, documented. The renewed world, those who saw forgetting as liberation, an escape from the cruelty of history, trauma, guilt, and inherited pain. Their cultures are fluid, ritualistic, leaning toward controlled cycles of forgetting. This schism defines foreign policy more deeply than borders or economies. Wars no longer involve land or ideology, but who owns the right to define the past. History has never been more political or more dangerous. In the mid-century, two global crises emerged. The War of Preservation, year 37. Rememberist nations sent forces to protect archives in regions where renewed factions destroyed historical data. It was the first war fought over museums, servers, libraries, and monuments, not land, not oil, not religion. The renewed War of Liberation, year 48. Renewed states attempted to impose ritual forgetting practices across border regions, believing trauma had infected global consciousness. The rememberists responded with overwhelming force. Both wars ended in stalemate because neither side understood the other's morality. Humanity no longer fought over the future, but over the right to remember the past. This was the most ironic legacy of the memoryless day. That forgetting created wars about remembering, a generation was born in the years after the event, Children raised not by parents who remembered their childhood, but by parents who remembered a day when they had forgotten their children entirely. This created a psychological phenomenon social scientists later named the phantom generation. Children grew up knowing their parents forgot them, mistook them for strangers, sometimes feared them, sometimes abandoned them, sometimes harmed others in their presence. These children grew up to adults with a double consciousness, one foot in their inherited past, one foot in the shadow of their parents' lost identity. They became the most introspective, the most anxious, the most philosophical, the most politically active generation in centuries. They also became the architects of the world that followed. For all the rebuilding, all the philosophy, all the systems, all the wars, all the attempts to control meaning, one question overshadows the century. Will it happen again? No answer satisfies. Scientists say the event was unique. Governments say preparations are sufficient. The renewed say another forgetting would cleanse us. Religious groups say the next time will be final. Philosophers say it is inevitable. Humanity lives with this dread the way early medieval Europe lived with the dread of plague, an entire species traumatized by the fragility of its own mind. The memoryless day did not just erase identity, it revealed identity as ephemeral, contingent, vulnerable. And that knowledge is a burden we cannot unknow. As I finish this chronicle, I confront a paradox no historian before me has faced. I must write a history of a day that no one remembers. The events exist only in reconstruction, videos, photos, accounts, artifacts. The memories of what happened are second-hand, reconstructed, fragile, just like everything else now. And yet, as I compile these pages, as I trace the arc of a civilization almost undone by one lost day, I arrive at a conclusion that once would have horrified me, but now feels inevitable. Maybe forgetting saved us. Not in its brutality, not in its chaos, not in the violence it unleashed, but in the truth it revealed. That beneath our layers of culture, our rituals, our knowledge, our beliefs, our sophistication, humanity remains an animal held together by the thin thread of memory. And when that thread snaps, what emerges is not evil, not purity, not destiny, but possibility. A possibility to see ourselves without the masks of history, a possibility to rebuild identity from zero, a possibility to choose what parts of ourselves are worth remembering and what parts are worth forgetting. The memoryless day was not an apocalypse, nor was it a miracle. It was a mirror, a brutal, honest mirror in which humanity saw its truest self, fragile, violent, creative, instinctive, fearful, resilient, and forever in search of meaning. And perhaps that is the final lesson. Memory is not who we are, it is what we carry in order to become who we must be. The world remembers that day. The world fears its return. The world lives differently because of it. But humanity, for all its fragility, survived the day it forgot itself, and in doing so, it finally learned what it means to remember.